Hello and welcome to week one of our digital learning online lectures. I hope everyone is staying safe through the current pandemic. Um, we are transitioning now that we know we're going to be learning through digital learning at home for the remainder of the school year. We will have one of these online lectures a week for social studies, for world history. It'll be every week on Thursday at 11 o'clock. It will post to the YouTube channel that I've created. And from there, if you're able to join live, great. I'll be there to respond to any comments while the video is playing for that first hour or so. The video lectures will be about 30 minutes, but I'll hang around for an hour to take questions. If you're not able to join live at 11, they will post on the page and be available for you to watch whenever. Some weeks it'll be us covering new material. And some weeks we'll be talking about things, and the assignment for you to do that week will be contained in the lecture. Like, I'll tell you what to do, explain it, and you'll need the information from the lecture to complete it. But this is week one. This week we'll be kind of touching up very briefly on the age of exploration, and then we will be primarily focusing on the age of absolutism. So this week, as a few reminders, you see here, it says all work from days 1 through 15 should be submitted. So the first 3 weeks before spring break, we had our assignments, pretty much daily assignments, days 1 through 15, for things to complete and turn in. If you've completed those, they need to be emailed to me. If you just need to take a picture of your work and email me the pictures, that's great. That's perfectly fine. And I'm putting those grades in as I receive them. Now, if you have not completed that work, it's very important you get it done soon, because they went in as two separate grades, a 100-point grade for weeks 1 and 2, and then week 3 was its own 50-point grade. So 10 points a day for all of the digital learning. That adds up pretty quickly. This week, it tells you here as well, you have 3 readings with questions to complete, 13 questions in total. You have a reading on the Columbian Exchange, you have a reading on Cortez, and you have a reading on Pizarro, Spanish conquistadors, where you'll get to see kind of what their contact with natives was like, and really how horrible it was for the native tribes. Answering questions there. You should be finishing the last set of that on Friday this week, so that would be tomorrow if you're watching this live. And once you complete the 13 questions, you should submit the work on Friday by email to me. Don't submit it till you have all 13 questions completed and have done all 3 readings. If you do it early, you can submit it. That's fine as well. But with that said, let's go ahead and get started with today's material. I know many of you probably have really missed your world history lectures, and really kind of feel cheated by missing those. So I know many of us are excited to get back to it. Here we see, and I'm going to kind of jump in and out with whether or not I'm on camera, because some of the slides I can't be, and you'll see why, because they kind of progressively add more, so I have to be in the presentation mode. But here at the beginning, I'll stick with you. It says exploration and expansion, voyages of discovery. I just pulled a few key components from the Age of Exploration material, because most of it you're learning in the readings this week. But the first part, I want to talk about why the Age of Exploration happened. And this kind of picks up from what we were talking about in class and continues from there. So a little bit of review to a few weeks ago with what we were talking about. It says, what caused the Age of Exploration? Well, we know the Renaissance led to a spirit of discovery, right? Where people were kind of pushed to learn more about the world, to know more, to appreciate human achievement, not base all knowledge just simply on religion and faith anymore, right? And that was a change from the Dark Ages, where they were very focused on religion. Remember, the Renaissance was a rebirth of Greek and Roman learning and philosophy, and it pushed that questioning spirit that we saw even in ancient Greece with Socrates, and the Socratic method of asking why, how do we know anything for sure, anything is a true fact, to question everything in life, right? And that pushes also a spirit of discovery. So for some of these explorers, it was simply to discover what was out there, especially once they realized that there was a new world, right? The Americas that they discovered really almost by accident. And then a lot of people were kind of hungry to get there and explore more, learn more about it once they realized it existed. We also see, for a lot of countries, it's going to be a search for wealth. People wanted to find a faster way to get to India to trade. A search for wealth both through trade, and we're also going to see a search for valuables like gold and silver. A faster way to get to India for trade, right? A way to get to Asia for spices and goods, silks, porcelains, things that they didn't really have much access to in Europe. And before this, if you remember, they would get there by taking the Silk Road, the trade route that went from Europe to Asia, and it passed through the Middle East and important stops in India as well. Now, if you remember, we talked recently about the Crusades, which kind of ended up bringing an end to the Dark Ages because they reignited an interest in trade, but they also created a legacy of bad blood between the Middle East and Europe. And in doing so, you're going to see a lot of places, towns, civilizations in the Middle East don't really want European merchants traveling through the Middle East anymore because the bad blood between them, there's a lack of trust, so it becomes difficult to take the Silk Road. And that's a big reason why a lot of Europeans were pushed to find a different route to get to Asia. So they're going to look to the sea. And there are advantages to that because you can bring so much cargo on the ships, it's faster, and you're carrying so much more that the profit potential is much higher. But it had never been done before. No one from Europe had ever made it to Asia by sea. They didn't even know if it was possible. They had a feeling that it could be done, but they've never accomplished it before. And the first route we're going to see, which will be accomplished by Portuguese explorers, is that they will sail from Europe, right? And they'll go west from Europe, south around Africa, right? And to Asia. Now, this is successful, and Portugal makes it to India by sailing around Africa, as you should have seen in the Age of Exploration videos last week or before the break. Now, this is not something that once Portugal learns how to do it, they're going to be eager to share with the rest of the world and teach everyone else how to explore and make it to Asia, because this is going to mean they can make huge amounts of money, right? And they want to be the ones making that money. They keep it a secret, really, this route that they were able to discover, and they're the first ones to do it. So the Portuguese become incredibly wealthy from trade through the sea to Asia. At first, they're leading the way in that very small country on the western tip of Europe. Very small, but they're going to lead the way early on. Then you will see other ideas spring about, like Columbus, who believed he could sail west to make it to Asia, and he attempts to do that, but eventually we know that he's instead going to land in the Americas, and then we have the discovery of the New World, right? And that really changes the scope of history. Now the focus becomes not only, hey, how do we get to Asia, but hey, how do we get to the New World? What could we exploit there? What could we find? There's a huge search for wealth in the New World, gold in particular. And we also see advances in technology that made exploration possible. Things like the compass and the astrolabe, which helped them chart where they were as they were sailing in the open ocean, for months at a time, hoping to land in the right place from their destination. But it was not easy to calculate. A lot of ships got lost. A lot of these explorers didn't survive. The voyages were very risky and dangerous. We also had the caravel, which is a quicker moving ship, and they had triangular sails that they could use to sail with the wind and also against it if need be, because they could trap the wind like in a wind tunnel and still move not as quickly. But all right, then we see at the bottom here the three G's: gold, God, and glory. And these are the motivations in particular for Spain, the conquistadors like Cortez and Pizarro that you should be reading about this week. They want to find gold, right? That's reason number one. They're going to become incredibly wealthy. Spain is going to find a ridiculous amount of gold and silver in the New World that will actually cause permanent inflation in Spain and be damaging to their economy long term, because they were on a gold standard, and gold was what the value of their currency was based on. And according to supply and demand, once they had too much gold, the value of gold actually drops, right? So it hurt them that they found almost too much in too short a time period in the long run. That many problems for Spain. We'll see. That's just one of them. God, they wanted to spread Christianity. In particular, remember, Spain was devoutly Catholic. Even though we saw the Reformation, where many Christians left the Catholic Church and formed new kinds of Protestant Christianity, which we talked about previously in class, Spain was devoutly Catholic, right? And they wanted to spread Catholicism to the New World. And then also glory for Spain and glory for the individual explorers who made it there. They wanted Spain to be seen as the most powerful country in the world, which at the time it was, right? And they wanted to make all this money from the New World, and they wanted to bring glory to Spain, right? So those were their major motivations. You also should be reading about the Columbian Exchange, which you see here, just incredibly interesting, I think. When you see the goods that arrived either from Europe to the New World for the first time, or on the top line here, goods that made it from the New World, the Americas, to Europe for the first time, right? So some examples that are surprising, right, that you should have seen in the reading. Things like tomatoes did not exist in Europe before the Columbian Exchange. They were only native to the Americas, and they had to be brought to Europe. So like a country like Italy was not making pizza, they were not making any kind of pasta or tomato sauces there before that. Or you see things like bananas being brought to the Americas for the first time, coffees being brought to the Americas for the first time. Many South American countries are known for their production of coffee today. Livestock, cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, cattle, so all of your beef, pigs, so all of the pork, horses, right? None of these things were native to the Americas before the Columbian Exchange. All right, so there was no beef, there was no pork, but we did see them brought over the Columbian Exchange. We also see horses, and when people think of horses, especially in America, we think of cowboys in the West and things like that. None of that would have been possible without horses being brought here by the explorers. All right. And then from there, that's just kind of an overview. You're seeing a lot more of that in your readings this week. But I want to change to the age of absolutism. So this is where I'm going to have to kind of jump out as far as the view of me. But you see, we're going to move into an age of absolute monarchs, and we're going to explain what that means here first before we talk about a few examples. And that's our goal for today, is to explain what absolutism is and to see a few examples of it in action. So it says, by the end of the Renaissance, new nations were formed in Europe. And you can see Europe taking place there, a lot more modern to what maybe we previously had seen. It says many of these nations were ruled by powerful kings with unlimited power, known as absolute monarchs. So this is one king who has absolute power. The age of absolutism means they were in control. No one could contest their opinions. They did whatever they wanted. No one else had any say in the government. All right, so truly incredibly powerful kings, some of the most powerful we've seen in all of history. Now, if you remember, going back to the Dark Ages and into the Renaissance, the problem with governments and kings in the Dark Ages is they were so weak that they didn't have the ability, they didn't have the wealth, they didn't have the authority to enforce laws, to raise an army. And people desperately wanted a stronger government. You remember we saw the writing of Machiavelli, The Prince, where he said, we need kings who can rule by the end justifies the means, absolute monarchs. And then Europe gets that. They get exactly what they were asking for, incredibly powerful kings. Some of them were successful, some were not. All right, I think in America sometimes we hear, absolute monarch or king, and we automatically think that's bad, right? Because that's what American history has kind of taught us, and the American Revolution was breaking away from the tyranny of a king. But some of these kings were successful, some definitely were not as well. It just depends. But people in the nation that's ruled by an absolute monarch have no say in government. They have no power. It is very easy for them to become kind of trampled on. So people wanted this because their governments were weak. And then once they get it, they're going to start realizing, hey, maybe we need to scale back the power of the king some. Maybe we need to give people a say in what happens. All right, and we'll see that reaction. There, from the 1600s to the mid-1700s, was known as the Age of Absolutism. Kings gained so much power. This part is review, but it's kind of encompassing a lot of things we talked about before, we switched to digital learning. So it's a good review. It says, during the Middle Ages, European kings were not very powerful. Like we just said, Dark Ages Europe, kings were pretty weak. The real power was in the hands of the nobles and the church officials. Kings didn't have enough money because people had abandoned cities, and therefore they couldn't really tax trade or anything. People just lived out in the countryside on feudal manors where they just farmed and got to keep a portion of what they grew, but most of it they were giving back to the landlord. So no real money to tax. Currency became scarce. It says instead feudal lords had real power because they controlled local manors and had the loyalty of the knights. The Catholic Church was the dominant religion in Europe. The Pope had power over the peasants. We talked about how incredibly powerful the Catholic Church and the Pope were during the Dark Ages. We see that the Crusades stimulated trade and led to the rise of cities. Whenever the knights came back from the Middle East, from the Crusades, those that survived, even though the Crusades did not succeed, they brought these valuable goods back from the Middle East that will inspire people in Europe to, hey, we want to trade, we want to be involved in the trade. So more people are traveling to trade, and we see that people want to move back to cities to interact with the merchants, because merchants are not going to want to travel around to these small little villages all throughout the countryside. They want to go to a city, a central hub where they have a lot of people to trade with, a high potential to make a lot of money. So as feudalism declined, the power of kings increases. People moving back to the cities means that the kings can once again tax all of this trade happening, and they are starting to grow in power. All right, you see cities are being moved back to, that's good for the kings. This trade sparked the Renaissance and weakened the power of feudal lords. So you see the feudal lords disappearing there from the pyramid. They're not really in the way of the kings anymore. It says during the 100 Years' War, new weapons like the cannon and longbow weakened the power of the nobles and knights. You see the longbow in this picture. You also see some crossbows, which crossbows were designed to pierce armor. And if there's a weapon designed to pierce armor, you don't want to be this huge lumbering knight that's moving slowly because you're wearing all this armor to protect you. It just makes you an easy target for the crossbow. And the cannons you see here were designed to take out castle walls. So in doing that, living on a manor that had castle walls to protect you, while that was incredibly safe during the Middle Ages, that's not as safe anymore as technology advanced. So as feudalism declined, the power of the knights are kind of removed from the picture. Now, the power of the Catholic Church will weaken as a result of the Crusades, because remember, the Pope said it was God's will that they reclaim the Holy Land. So when they fail, it makes the Pope look bad. And that hurts the reputation of the Catholic Church. People start to not trust them quite as much. Then the Protestant Reformation, where huge numbers of people start leaving the Catholic Church, and eventually all of England is forced to convert to a Protestant form of Christianity in the Anglican Church. That hurts the Catholic Church in a huge way. They can't have the same level of authority and control over the people of Europe if not everyone in Europe is Catholic anymore. As the power of the church declined, the power of the kings increases again. And now you see there's no one to oppose him. You have the commoners at the bottom, the peasants, who have no power, and then the king. So all the power is there, true absolute monarch. During the Renaissance, European kings taxed merchants and bankers and used the wealth to build powerful armies. Monarchs used their power to build centralized governments to control their nations. Some monarchs used overseas exploration, the age of exploration, to gain colonies and increase their wealth and power. They will claim land overseas that they can then use the natural resources from, they can benefit from, and make more and more money, not only from their own country that they used to control, but now this new land that they have claimed somewhere else. By 1600, some European kings had become absolute monarchs. And we see some examples here. We're not going to talk about all of them, but we are going to talk about Philip II, Louis XIV, and Peter the Great of Russia. Those are the three we're going to look at today. As those go away. See, absolute monarchy is a government in which one king should hold all the power within a country. That's an absolute monarchy. Absolute monarchs controlled all aspects of their nations, including taxes, religion, the military, and the economy. Absolute monarchs believed in divine right, the idea that God created the monarchy, and kings answered only to God, not to the people. So if your people, your subjects, have complaints, or they're unhappy with how you're doing things, or there's not enough food for them and they're upset, none of that should matter to the king. Right? The end justifies the means. He accomplishes his goals no matter what. Not really worried about the concerns of the people. All right, looking first at Philip II of Spain. This one is an example of maybe a monarch who didn't do so well, who didn't really succeed in every way possible. So it says, as king, Philip controlled Spain, the Netherlands, and colonies in America. But Philip took Portugal and its colonies in Africa and India as well. Huge amount of territory under his control. When he comes to power, Spain was incredibly powerful, right? It was the most powerful country in Europe at the time. After its downfall, that has definitely never been true again. All right, now, some of the reasons for its downfall are kind of Philip's fault. Some of them are not necessarily his fault. They just happened during his reign. So it says, this brought Spain great wealth, which Philip used to build a strong army and the Spanish Armada. The Spanish Armada is an incredibly massive navy that Spain built. There's stories about how they cleared out almost all of the lumber, all of the trees available in Spain to build this massive armada of ships that they wanted to use to create a blockade around countries they were fighting against. They would line the ships up end to end and form a wall of ships that their enemy could not get past. Massive ships, larger than had been used and designed before, incredibly intimidating. This is why people really started to view Spain as so powerful. They put that wealth they gained from exploration into things like this armada to become more and more powerful. But even that armada is going to backfire. So it says Philip used his navy to defend Catholicism against English Protestants and Ottoman Muslims. So it's interesting because we see that Philip claimed he was going to use the navy to defend the Catholic Church. So if you're defending, okay, well, you're defending the Catholic Church. Sure, Spain's devoutly Catholic. None of that sticks out as too odd. But we say he's going to defend Catholicism. And then we see the first thing that it says he does here is the Spanish Armada will unsuccessfully attack Protestant England. Not a defense, right? They tried to attack England, and now their claim is they're attacking England because England was Protestant, not Catholic. And they felt it was wrong that England was no longer Catholic, that they had moved away during the English Reformation. Now, it's unsuccessful, and this was seen as a massive upset when Spain is defeated. And you have Queen Elizabeth there and in charge of England at the time, and she works with who she appoints naval captain, who is Sir Francis Drake, an explorer from the Age of Exploration, kind of viewed like a pirate by a lot of people from other countries because he often, would attack French and Spanish ships and just steal their cargo. And when complaints were made to Elizabeth about the way he conducted himself, she just didn't really care. She thought it was fine. All right, now he comes up with the plan that they empty out some of England's much smaller ships, fill them, well, they don't empty them out, they fill them up with gunpowder, and they don't have people on them. And then they set the sails of these ships on fire and have them sail towards the Armada. So they're basically like floating bombs. And they start crashing into the Armada and exploding. And it doesn't take out all of the Armada, but it causes Spain to panic. And these larger ships start breaking formation. Remember, they were set up like a wall. And they start breaking formation to try to avoid the ships that Drake was sending towards them. And then once these large ships broke that wall formation, now they're slow, lumbering, huge ships that take a long time to turn around. And England attacks with their much smaller ships, and they attack the weak points of these ships again and again as the big armada ships can't turn around, they can't get set up. So they end up being almost completely destroyed. It's a huge upset in favor of England, and the Spanish Armada is literally a sunken cost. All right, so a big defeat for Spain. That's one of the first problems for them. We see a picture of Philip's palace here. Massive, incredibly ornate. We're going to see that a lot during the Age of Absolutism. This isn't even the largest one we'll see, but still, it's there as a tourist attraction now. So the decline of Spain again. It says, despite his leadership, Spain declined during Philip's rule. It's Philip II. You see him pictured here. It says, the influx of gold led to massive inflation and prices soared. Spain did not manufacture anything to sell. It bought all of its goods from other countries. So 1 and 2. 1, the inflation from all the gold they brought from other countries actually devalued gold. Individual pieces of gold were not worth as much anymore because they had so much gold suddenly. And Spain was dependent on other countries. They didn't manufacture hardly anything on their own, which ends up being a big problem. Now, they don't manufacture anything, so they have to import goods from all these other countries, right? They don't make much that they ship to other countries and sell. They're buying everything from everyone else. Now, why is that a problem? Because let's say you buy gunpowder from France. Then either France goes to a war, maybe with you or maybe not, but if they're at war with England, let's say, well, now they need all this gunpowder and they can't afford to sell you any. And now that means you just don't have any because you don't produce it on your own, right? There's this concern even in America that people were manufacturing our own things and we rely too much on other countries like China that we buy things from. Now, there's some truth to that. It just depends, right? If you look back in history, Walmart used to be a store that prided itself on they only sold American goods. Nowadays, you can go into Walmart and it's almost tough to find things that are made in America. So it has shifted drastically. And that was a problem for Spain. They didn't manufacture anything on their own. See, the Netherlands broke away from Spain in 1579. That was bad for Spain because the Netherlands were known for trade. They had established really profitable trade routes. They made a lot of money for Spain. So it was another hit while they were already having other problems. And then the final one, which is a big deal, but a different kind of tone to it, is it says the inbreeding will end the Habsburg dynasty in 1700. So a little bit down the line. But the Habsburg dynasty, we see Philip is a member of the Habsburg dynasty. Inbreeding means, within the family. And that's what it's saying. And it's pretty horrible. I mean, this isn't like, he nowadays make jokes about like, well, if you live in Georgia, you say, hey, people in Alabama, they're always marrying their cousins or something like that. And then people in Alabama say the same thing about Georgia, right? But this is much worse than cousins, unfortunately. It says, how bad was the Habsburgs' inbreeding? Well, our examples here, it says Charles's mother was a niece of Charles's father. So his mother was also a niece of his father. You can do the connecting the dots if you want. Maria Anna was his aunt and also his grandmother. So Charles is Philip's father. So Maria Anna was his aunt and also his grandmother. So if they're grandmother first, then how do you become the aunt of this other kid? Well, right, she had to have married one of her own kids, one of her own sons, and had a child with her own son for that to happen. Margaret of Austria was his grandmother and his great-grandmother. So great-grandmother and grandmother again, marrying one of her own children to be the great-grandmother and the grandmother. Then the inbreeding was so bad that his 8 great-grandparents were all descendants of the same couple, Joanne and Philip I. So 8 great-grandparents. You imagine this couple, Joanne and Philip I, how lucky were they? Not really, but in their minds for the way they did things here in Spain. They had 8 kids. They just so happened to have 4 sons and 4 daughters. And to them, it's, hey, everybody's got someone to marry now. Okay. Now, why would they do this? It's appalling to us today, understandably, but why would they do this? Because they wanted royal blood to remain royal. They didn't want people from royalty marrying commoners. Now, other countries would had the practice of like, a princess from Russia would marry a prince from some other country, right? And that way it's still royalty, and you're kind of creating an alliance and doing that. But Spain had this pride that they wanted to remain within Spain because they viewed themselves as this leading country in Europe, and they were so devoutly Catholic, they didn't want to marry outside of Spain. So the pool for who your options are, royalty only in Spain, becomes very small. It becomes family members. All right. Now looking next at Louis the 14th, right? 14th, you got 10, and then one less than 5 with the Roman numerals there. So Louis XIV of France, you see him pictured here. He is like the ultimate example of an absolute monarch. So it says France before Louis XIV. Before Louis XIV came to power, France was a nation in conflict between Catholics and French Protestants called Huguenots. King Henry IV, who is Louis's father, tried to fix this issue by declaring religious toleration in the Edict of Nantes. After Henry IV died, Catholic leaders took control of France, ended the Edict of Nantes, and weakened the power of nobles and increased the power of the monarchy. So you had before, Louis's father tried to say, hey, you can practice whatever religion you want. I know there's religious turmoil between the Protestants and the Catholics here. You can be whatever you want. Doesn't matter. Okay? Now, that's nice from a legal standpoint, but that doesn't mean the people of France suddenly were okay with, it doesn't mean like the Catholics were okay with being neighbors with Protestants. There's still a lot of fighting between them. So when he dies, his son was too young to take over. Louis was too young to take over. So instead, they had this interim period where the Catholic leaders, the cardinals, took over and had control of France. And they will decide to increase the power of the monarchy. So they're Catholic, so they're going to say, no, the official religion is Catholic. They're supporting the Catholic Church, not the Protestants in France. And they make an incredibly smart decision to increase the power of the monarchy. Why is that incredibly smart? Well, because when he becomes old enough, Louis is going to take over. And he is taking over now as monarch, even more powerful than his father had been, because these religious leaders had said, hey, let's make the king more powerful. They're doing this because they know it will create an alliance between them and the future king. So when Louis takes over, he's going to see them as friends, allies, who got him more power. And who do you think he's going to support? Not the Protestant church, but the Catholic Church, who supported him. So they're creating an ally, a very important, even more powerful ally that they've seen to, making sure he's even more powerful. Right? So by the time Louis came to power, France was an absolute monarchy. He will rule France for 72 years and become a classic example of an absolute monarchy. He takes over very young. I believe he dies at 76 years old, so he takes over at 4, in name, in title at least. and rules for his entire life. The next 72 years, he's the king. Imagine how much that would go to your head if you were an absolute monarch from the time you were 4 until the time you die at 76. All he ever knew was this life of absolute authority over everyone he ever encountered. Louis XIV believed that he was the government. He excluded nobles from government decisions and hired bureaucrats to collect taxes and enforce laws. He called himself the Sun King because he felt that French power emanated from him. He said he was the Sun King. Like, imagine giving yourself that title. He says, I am the Sun King. All power in France emanates from me, just like rays of light and heat emanate from the sun. There are some ways he has a positive impact on France. It says his economic advisors used overseas colonies and mercantilism to generate new wealth, so more money for France. He encouraged manufacturing to make sure that France was self-sufficient. So they wanted to produce the goods they needed within France. They didn't want to rely on other countries the way that Spain did. And we saw that having to import everything was a bad thing for Spain. They became dependent on imports and trade. Now, trade is good for an economy. Trade. You want it to be, something you do on top of your country that's already self-sufficient. So it says, with this wealth, Louis built a powerful army and transformed France into the most powerful nation in Europe. There are some ways he also has a negative impact on France. It says he involved France in many expensive wars that really failed to gain anything important or new territory for France. So there's massive debt that is generated from this, and they don't really get much out of it. He also used wealth and art to glorify himself, including constructing the massive Palace of Versailles, which will come up several times in history. This Palace of Versailles, probably the most famous palace built really in all of European history, possibly in the world. All right, massive palace. You see it pictured here, and all of the gardens around it are part of it as well. Incredibly ornate, fancy, and expensive as it could have been, right? So focused on it, building this palace for him as the Sun King. We'll see many important historical moments take place in the Palace of Versailles later. So it was just the first time seeing it. Some quick, interesting things about it. It says, Louis XIV's palace at Versailles was proof of his absolute power. Only a ruler with total control of his country's economy could afford such a lavish palace. It cost an estimated $2.5 billion in 2003, so much more than that now. And that's just for the actual materials and everything used, not even counting the labor, because the labor wasn't paid like that. That's not part of it. He was also able to force 36,000 laborers and 6,000 horses into work on the project. It says many people consider the Hall of Mirrors, which we'll see a bigger picture of in a second, but it's there on the left, to be the most beautiful room in the palace. Along one wall are 17 tall mirrors. The opposite was 17 matching windows so that people could look out into the gardens. Or if you were looking in the mirrors, you could see the gardens through the mirror. They would hold balls and things here in the Hall of Mirrors. You'd be people dancing and all of that, hors d'oeuvres being served. You get the idea. You have crystal chandeliers. You have gold leafing on the walls. The whole ceiling is all painted like if it was a Renaissance temple. And in this time period, mirrors were incredibly hard to produce and very expensive, so even those were a sign of the wealth. It says it took so much water to run all the fountains at once that it was done only for special events. On other days, when the king walked in the gardens, servants would turn on fountains just before he reached them. The fountains were turned off after he walked away. So they would have people positioned in the garden to turn on the fountains before he came around a corner to see it, and then after he passed, they would turn it off because it took so much water. It was ridiculous. There were so many fountains. Right, and we'll see that. It says the gardens at Versailles remain beautiful today. They're a tourist attraction. Versailles is a museum where people who visit it talk about how it takes several days to view the palace and the gardens, and you obviously don't see all the gardens because it's so massive. Originally, Versailles was built with 5,000 acres of gardens, lawns, and woods. That's a huge amount of space. You can think about like the football stadium at Douglas County. That's about an acre. All right, so 5,000 acres of gardens, lawns, and woods, and then 1,400 fountains throughout it. All right, so you can see why it took so much water to operate them. Here's a blown up picture of the Hall of Mirrors. Legacy of Louis XIV. As a result of Louis XIV, France became the most powerful nation in Europe. But decades of lavish spending by monarchs led to massive debts and heavy taxes. Eventually, the French people grew frustrated and overthrew the monarchy. And you see, this is not Louis XIV, but a future king, monarch in France who we'll talk about, who's being executed here. All right, Peter the Great, I'm going to go very quickly through just to kind of finish up here. But we see a picture of Peter the Great, so a little different in the way he depicts himself than Louis XIV did. It says Russia before Peter the Great. Russia was influenced by the Byzantine Empire, but had been conquered by the Mongols, both of which we talked about, right? Kiev getting its start from influence by the Byzantine Empire, and then they were conquered by the Mongols, became part of the Khanate of the Golden Horde. Ivan III, Ivan Moneybags, eventually broke free from Mongol control and became the first Tsar, which was the title for king, ruler, emperor, basically, in Russia. Tsar, it was a tribute to Caesar, right? Because we saw that Russia believed they were so heavily influenced by the Byzantine Empire, which was once part of the Roman Empire. Over time, Tsars expanded Russia's borders, increased their power over the nobles, and created an absolute monarchy. By the time Peter the Great became Tsar in 1682, Russia was a massive empire. You see it there in the dark orange, huge. But Russia was not as advanced as Western European nations. We will see that Russia will continue to struggle for a long time in history with the fact that they were less advanced. Their industry was not as far along. Their technology was not as good. They were not viewed by Europe as being part of Europe. They were viewed as kind of Asian, Eastern, not the same as Europe. They wanted to be viewed as part of Western Europe. Russia was isolated from Western Europe, though, and they knew very little about the new ideas of the Renaissance. They missed out on the Renaissance. So if they didn't go through the Renaissance, that means they're still kind of stuck in the dark ages of feudalism, which they were. They don't have all of these advancements from the Renaissance and the Reformation, and everything that took place after it has not happened in Russia. While European nations grew wealthy from trade, made cultural advances, and had strong economies, Russia had no advanced industry, no overseas colonies, and an economy of small-scale farmers. Right, so feudalism in Russia, you see it on the west. It doesn't look like the advanced cities of Europe at this time. The way they dress, completely different. Right, they're wearing long robes and things, and it doesn't look European. That's why the Europeans view them as different. Tsar Peter the Great wanted to modernize or westernize Russia to catch up with Europe. He will travel in disguise throughout Europe to learn new ways of how he doesn't travel being known as Peter, Tsar of Russia. He travels and spends years in Europe working on shipyards, training with military, seeing how they're trained, learning how to build ships by hand, seeing how Europeans dress, right? Seeing what kind of food they eat, what kind of music they listen to, all of it that he sees as important for Russia to copy. Then he comes back and he teaches people how to build ships, how to organize a navy, how to organize an army, right? While in Europe, Peter learned new ideas about shipbuilding, manufacturing, government organization, city planning, music, and fashion. When he returned from Europe, Peter imposed new reforms to westernize Russia. He adopted European fashions by banning beards for men and veils for women. So it was traditional for nobility in Russia to have long beards. He said, can't have many more. And he famously, when he returned and was being greeted by one of the nobles, pulled scissors out from behind his back and cut the beard of this noble, saying that's part of the reason why we're viewed different. We're not going to do that anymore. And veils for women, like veiling covering their face, which we would kind of associate maybe with the Middle East nowadays. That was something Russia used to do as well, that they know, he realized this is part of why we're viewed as different. So he said, you're not allowed to veil your faces. They also adopted a European calendar, improved farming techniques, used mercantilism as an economic policy, created iron and lumber factories so they could produce things on their own. He modernized the army and navy, made himself head of the Orthodox Church, just like Henry was head of the church in England. So he's more powerful. They're becoming like Europe in so many ways. Not just how their military is, but also their economy, the way they dress, the food they eat, the music they listen to. He wants everything to be more European. And at the time, there was a lot of opposition. People don't like change. So the nobility especially did not like Peter. Now, history and time has shown us that this was great for Russia. And he doesn't completely catch Russia up, but he closes the gap significantly. Even when we get to World War I and II, we'll see problems for Russia because their industry and their production was behind. But he gets them a lot closer than they were. A lot of advancement. He also expanded Russia's border and built a new European-style Russian capital at St. Petersburg, which you can see up here in the purple. As a result of Peter the Great, Russia became a more advanced Western nation, but modernization was a slow process. Russia had not fully industrialized by the time World War I started. During World War I, revolutionaries overthrew the monarchy and created a radical new government based on socialism, right, which was the Communist Revolution. And this is when Russia becomes the Soviet Union. You can see the flag of that there at the top. Here are some of Peter's castles. He had several palaces and castles, not just one. Palaces would be the right word. He actually had the Winter Palace and the Summer Palace, which he would live in for portions of the year. Incredibly ornate over the top. You can see it. Marble all over, paintings on the ceilings, gold leafing, that Baroque over the top style. All right, and here's the Winter Palace. They're both museums nowadays. They house a lot of art and things, so huge tourist attraction. And the Summer Palace. You see all the gold statues out front, all the people lined up because it is, like we said, a tourist attraction. All right, and this is interesting because this is St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. And this was actually not designed by a Russian architect, but it was a Italian architect who was hired to come in and build a church for Russia. And they wanted this most magnificent church possible in the world, right? They wanted the most magnificent, ornate, beautiful church. And this is what the Italian architect thought was fitting for Russia. I show you that because it's a sign of how they viewed Russia as being different. You know, the onion top domes, the way this church is designed. If I didn't tell you it was a church, I don't think a lot of people would think it maybe was. It doesn't really look like what we imagine, especially as a European church from the Renaissance. But they viewed Russia as different, so they designed a different style church for them. That's the kind of reputation that Peter was trying to change. And you saw his palaces didn't look like this. They looked like European palaces, and that was definitely intentional. All right. We will stop there for today. We'll pick up next week with a different topic. Assignments will be posted again probably by the weekend for next week, so you can get an idea of what's expected. Remember, I need your 13 questions from the 3 readings on the Age of Exploration on Friday when you get them done. Have a good week.